Today's lecture is an introduction to JavaScript. So, JavaScript is, first of all, nothing at all to do with Java. They're completely different languages. Secondly, it's best known for its application within web browsers. However, it is actually a fully fledged scripting language. It can be used for standalone applications. There are a number of interpreters like Node.js, JSDB, Java-like script, GlueScript, which allow you to run programs that you've written in JavaScript just in the same way as you would run a program written in a language like Python or Perl. And in fact, I've had a student recently using JavaScript for populating a NoSQL database. However, as I said, usually it's best known for its application within web browsers, allowing you to make your web pages much more interesting, more dynamic, things like pull-down menus, accordions, that sort of thing, allowing you to change the pages that you have in response to buttons, and I'll show you an example of that in a few minutes. Allowing you to check the contents of forms, for example, checking that an email address really is an email address. And probably most interestingly, but actually fairly difficult to implement, asynchronous loading of page content. This idea that is known as AJAX, which actually stands for asynchronous JavaScript and XML, but XML doesn't actually have to play any part in this. Again, we'll come on to an example of how you do this later on. So in this lecture, we're going to concentrate on the application of JavaScript in building better looking web pages and look at 4 simple types of application. So some basics about what JavaScript is. First of all, it's an object-oriented language, but as with most object-oriented languages, how much you make use of objects is really up to you. Secondly, it's loosely typed, and that means that you can assign a variable, say A, initially set it to being an integer, then later on you can change it to being a string, and so on. It says here you must declare variables with var. That's not altogether true, but it's highly recommended. Using var limits the scope of a variable. It restricts the scope of the variable to the function in which it is defined. Functions are declared with the function keyword. Unlike Python, but like languages like Perl and C and C++, you end lines with a semicolon. Comments can be introduced simply with 2 slashes, or a multi-line comment can be wrapped in /* and finished with */. Of course, because most of its applications are within web pages, there is a close tie-in with HTML. So, for example, there's a function document.write, which will simply write something to the current page. And we'll see examples of all these things in a few minutes. And you can also use it to manipulate the DOM. Now, you should recall from the data management lecture that I gave you on reading and writing XML from within Python, that there is this thing, the DOM, the document object model. Now, you should recall from the data management lecture that I gave you that on reading and writing XML from Python, that there is this data structure known as the DOM, the Document Object Model. Now, when I gave you that lecture, and also when I gave you the introduction to HTML, I talked about the similarities between HTML and XML. Now, within most web browsers, the document that you're looking at, the HTML that you're looking at, is represented using the document object model, the same type of representation that is used for storing XML internally within programs. And we talked in that lecture and the practical that you did about using various functions for the DOM, which allowed you to extract things, manipulate things, and so on. And all the same functions are available within JavaScript to manipulate your web page. Now, a few notes about HTML that are relevant to using JavaScript. First of all, one of the things that we want to do quite often is make something appear on a page. So the way that we do that is often to use an empty or a hidden div or span, and then do something with it, populate it, unhide it, or whatever. The ID attribute for elements is a unique identifier within a given page. So you're only, if you have ID equals XYZ, you can only have one ID set to XYZ anywhere on the page. So that allows you to identify explicitly a given particular element, whether it's a div or a paragraph or whatever. One other thing that HTML provides in association with JavaScript, at least HTML5 provides it, is what's called a canvas that allows you to do drawings and graphics within a page. Okay, so let's have a look at how we integrate JavaScript into a web page. Now, it's actually very simple. All we do is we have a script tag, type equals text/JavaScript, and then we have a function. In this case, the function takes two numbers, in1 and in2, multiplies them together and returns the result. So if we do that, if we call that function do something 57, it'll multiply the two numbers together and give you a value of 35. So if we put that within a document.write, then the 35 will be displayed on the screen as we see here. If we take a look at the source code for this web page, do up here, you'll see that that bit that I just showed you is actually running that piece of JavaScript. It's calling the function do something here with the parameters 5 and 7, and the function is returning the number, and we're doing a document.write in order to display the number 35. The div up here is just using some features of a particular library of CSS in order to produce this coloured example that we've got with the red and the red bar on the left. Now, something else that is really useful is that we can trigger JavaScript from buttons, links that you have, the A tag href equals. Instead of href, you can use onClick. and on click is then followed by a piece of JavaScript that you want to call. So we can do this, as I said, in A tags, the anchor tags, but we can also do it in buttons. And things like this button that you see at the bottom here, these are created with these button tags. Now the example I've shown you above, up here, made use of JavaScript embedded within the HTML. But we can also put JavaScript in a separate file, and that can be a local file, so we say script source equals and the name of the file, or it can be a remote file. So we give the full URL to the file that we want to access. One thing to remember is that the script tag is not a self-closing tag. So even when you actually have no JavaScript, you're simply importing JavaScript from somewhere else, you need to have the closing tag to go with it. Now, before I carry on, I will just mention two libraries that are very useful to make your JavaScript simpler. I'm not going to go into them in any detail in this lecture at all, but one is called jQuery. It allows you to amongst many other things, it allows you to find elements very quickly, very easily, without using the normal DOM functions. And it has lots of other facilities built in as well. The second is Bootstrap, and these web pages for the Biocomputing lectures are all created using Bootstrap. Bootstrap is a mixture of a JavaScript library and a CSS library, which allows you to produce very attractive looking web pages very easily. We're going to go through 4 different types of application of JavaScript. And the first of these is writing content, in other words, creating content within a web page. Now we've just seen an example of that with that simple function for multiplying 2 numbers together, but let's look at some things that are a little bit more useful. So the first of these is a last modified indicator. So this is a simple way of having on every web page that you write an indication of when that web page was last updated. Now, of course, if you have a very simple website with just a few pages, then it's quite simple just to update that yourself as you modify the page. But if you have a website with dozens or hundreds of pages, then it's becomes a nightmare to maintain that sort of thing. And if you make frequent changes, of course, it's also very difficult to remember what you're doing. It turns out to be very simple to create a last modified piece of text using JavaScript. All we need to do is call this document.write function that we've seen before, and we pass it a string which has the last modified date in it. The way that I've done that here, I've split the string over 3 lines simply so that it fits on the page, and it is split into the relevant sections. So you don't have to do that, you could put it all on one line. But here we've created a paragraph tag with a class of last modified so that we can style it attractively using CSS. We've then created some text, last modified, and then again we're accessing this document, but this time we're using the last modified method within it, which simply tells you the date that the page was last changed. And then we're finishing the paragraph. By doing that, we get a piece of text like this. Now, if you want something more consistent, you'll have to work a little bit harder, because as you see, This has shown the date in the American format of month first and then the day. If you wanted the European format of day first and then month, you'd have to work a bit harder. And in fact, the layout of these dates and numbers varies between different web browsers. Now, I'm not going to go through it now, but I've provided a bit of JavaScript here that you can download, and that will deal with displaying that for you. The second example we're going to look at is hiding email addresses. The problem with putting your email address on a web page is that people can come along and scrape those email addresses to harvest them for purposes of sending out spam. So quite often on an email address on a web page, you might see something like andrew-at-me.com, or replace the hash with an at, andrew-me.com, or replace the star with an at and the hash with a dot, andrew-me-com. Or indeed, some people will put their email address in a GIF or a PNG image rather than having it as text within the HTML. So an alternative approach is to hide your email address using JavaScript. So in this example, we have a function called printEm, which then takes three parameters. The first is the name that you want to send to. The second is the domain name, but instead of using dots, we put, in this case, hash signs, and then we specify the character that needs to be replaced with a dot. So if we look at the actual code, then the function takes the name, domain name, and the character. It then appends the domain name to the name and puts an @ sign in between the two, creates a variable called EMAddress. And then it uses the replace method of the string object and a regular expression, which takes the character, matches it globally, and replaces it with a dot. So that ends up replacing the hash signs in the example, as I've done here, with dots. So you get the bioinf.org.uk. Here I've commented out just a little bit of debugging code. There's a useful function in JavaScript called alert, which will just take a piece of text and display an alert box containing that piece of text, and you then have to press OK for the code to continue. So as I say, I've commented that out. What I've then done is use document.write and document.writeln. So document.writeln behaves the same way as print does in Python. It appends a line break at the end of the string, whereas document.write doesn't. So here I've put a span of class EM. I've then put a mail to link, which allows you to create a clickable email address which will fire up a piece of email software. So I've used the anchor tag to make a link, href mail to, then I've appended onto that the email address, and then closed the opening a tag. Then I've put the email address, and then I've closed the put in the closing tag, and finally I've put a close to the EM span. So what you get when you do this then is an email address like this, and as you can see, it's clickable and it will fire up the email software, and you can download that piece of code and try it. The third example that we're going to look at for creating content is something for displaying the next event in a series. So this might be something like meetings or podcasts, or I don't know, anything where you have a series of meetings or events. So it's quite often useful to have a banner at the top of a web page announcing when the next event in a series occurs, but of course it's a pain to remember to update these things. You could do it automatically with a CGI script of some sort, but it's much easier with JavaScript. So the process is as follows. We create an array with the events and their dates. We then, in the JavaScript, we're checking what the current date is and display then the first event from the array with a date which is equal to or later than the current date. So here's the code that does this, and I've decided to implement this using full object orientation just as an example. So here we're defining our array of events. We create a variable called gEvents, and that's a new array. Now here I've adopted a convention of anything that's a global variable starts with a lowercase letter g followed by an uppercase letter. So being a global variable, that means that all the functions here will be able to access it without having to pass it around between them. So I'm then using the push method of the array object to append items onto this array. The first thing I'm appending then is an event date object. So I'm saying new event date, and we'll see the function that creates that in just a second, passing it the day, the month, the year, and a title for the event. And then I'm doing the same with two more events. So if I just jump down here to the event date function, it takes those four parameters, the day, the month, the year, and the title. And what it then does is use this to make this into a constructor function which constructs an object. It sets the date to the current date. Now that uses a method that is provided to create a new date object. You pass that the year, the month, which awkwardly counts from 0 instead of 1, the day, and then the hours, minutes, and seconds. That creates a date object, and it will store that in this.date. And then we store the title in this.title. And so now we have created an object with the date and the title for this particular event. What we now do when we've created this array is to call the display next event date function. So that's defined here. And all that does is, first of all, finds what the next event is, and I'll explain that function in just a second. Then it simplifies the date into a nicely formatted date for printing. And then it uses the writeLine, document.writeLine method to display, first of all, a div with an ID of next event, then a span of class announce, which contains the word next event, then another span of class event date, which contains the simplified date that came back from this simplified date method, which again I'll explain in just a minute, ends that span, and then we have another span of class event title, which contains the title for the next event, and finally we end the div. So let's look at those two functions that we defined, next event date and simplified date. So next event date is very simple. It finds out what today's date is, and then it acts as a constructor. It sets the date of this object to being blank, and sets the title to a default title of sorry, no more events have been scheduled. It then loops through the array of events, finds the time from the date item within the object, and sees whether it's greater than today's time or equal to today's time. If it is, then it resets the date part of this object to the date for that event, and resets the title to the title for that event, and then it breaks out of the loop. So because this is an object constructor, it doesn't need to return anything explicitly. Instead, when we call it with new, as we did up here, the object that's returned will contain these fields of date and title. Now the simplified date function, again this is an object constructor, and it's actually very similar to code that was used in the example where I didn't show you the code itself in any detail, which was used for displaying the last modified information. What it does is creates an array of month names, from month 0 being January through to month 11 being December. And then it tests whether the date string that's been passed in is blank. If it is, it sets the text for the simplified date to a blank as well. Otherwise, if it's not blank, then it gets the year out of the date string. Now, here we have a bit of a problem because different versions of web browsers return years in different ways. So some versions of Internet Explorer give you a 2-digit year, so 2020 would be returned as just 20. Other versions of Microsoft Explorer and older versions of Netscape, which was the early version of Firefox, give you a 4-digit year, so 2020 would be 2020. While more recent versions of Netscape and Firefox give you the number of years since 1900, so 2000 as shown here would be 100, 2020 would be 120. So we have then a bit of code that has to deal with this. If the year is less than 80, so actually this bit of code will break in the year 2080, we add 2000 onto the year. Otherwise, if the year is less than 1900, then we add 1900 onto the year. And if it was greater than 1900, then we don't need to do anything. It's already a 4-digit year. So we then construct a piece of text for the date, which we use the date string that came in. We get the date, that's the day of the month. We add a dash. We add the month, so we're using getMonth to find the month number, and then we look up the month from the array that we created earlier. We add another dash, and then we add the year. So you can download this piece of code. And the result from doing that then, in this case, is next event, 15th February 2025, is event 2. Now if we just go back up and look what we had in our array, we had 3 events. The first one was in the past, second and third ones are in the future, so the one to come up was the earliest of those, which was event 2, and that's exactly what we wished to happen. The next application of JavaScript that we're going to look at is showing and hiding content. Things like drop-down menus, form elements, and so on. So the first thing that we can do is we can manipulate the CSS from within the JavaScript. So I apologise that this is kind of grey on grey. This is to do with the theme of the background. So some versions of Firefox actually ignore information that you've given about what the back of buttons and things should look like, and instead use the overall theme that has been defined for the desktop. So I don't know if you can read this, but it says grey body, white body, red div, white div. And if we click on grey body, you'll see that the body element of the HTML has now changed from white to grey, and we click on white body and it will go back again. The div refers to this box around the buttons, so I can click red div and it will change to red, and white div and it will change to white. And of course I can combine these things together. And what that's doing then is manipulating the CSS instead of the HTML or modifying the DOM as we saw before. Let's have a look at the code that does that. So we have two functions that we've defined: document.body.style.background, and set it to a particular color. And we have document.getElementById. Now you should recall that from what we looked at in the lectures previously on handling the DOM. So we give it an element ID, and then .style.background equals color. So this first function, set background color, we just pass it a color, and that is the one that we used up here to manipulate the whole body. And this function takes the identifier for a particular element, so it's the identifier for this div, and sets the color of that. So the actual HTML that we've used here then is we've defined a div, we've given it an ID of BG, and we've specified its style. That gives us the padding and this border around the outside. And then we've defined the 4 buttons and said on click for the first button, set the background color to CC, which is grey, and the second button is FF, which is white. And then we've got this slightly more flexible function where we pass it the ID that we want to modify, in this case BG, and the color that we want to use. And again, you can download the code and have a play with this. We can use the same sort of approach then for showing or hiding a whole div or span. So here I've got a button labeled toggle, and if I click that, then it shows me a new div with the word some content. If I click it again, it will hide it. So let's have a look at the code that does that. So we have two functions, show element and hide element. And show element uses document.getElementById. The identifier for the element is passed in. Set the style display to block, which means show it. And then we have a second function, hide element, again takes an element ID, document.getElementById, the element identifier, .style.display set to none. Those are the two functions which do the showing and the hiding of the function. Then we need something to do the toggling. So what we have there is a function called toggle element. Again, it takes the element ID as a parameter and says if document.getElementById and the element name .style.display is set to none, then we'll show it. Otherwise, we'll hide it. So that has the effect of toggling this element on and off. And then the actual HTML, there's a button, on click equals, and then we have the toggle element method, and the element ID is called show hide, and then the text that appears within the button. And here's our div, which had that red background and had the text some content, has the ID of show hide, which is what we're passing into the toggle element method of the JavaScript. And here we've defaulted to a display of none, so it's not shown to start with, and when we click on the toggle it gets shown, click it again, it gets hidden. Again, you can download this piece of code. So a more real application of that then would be in manipulating a form. Now you should recognize this from the CGI practical that you did, where you were asked to write a page where you entered your name, you entered some sequence data, and then you had some buttons to specify whether it was protein or DNA, and some buttons for doing different types of analysis. Now, it's fairly obvious then that certain analyses might be applicable only to protein and not to DNA. So here, if I enter some text here, enter some text here, this is my sequence, and I have these buttons then for doing the different analyses. Now, let's suppose the first two analyses could be done on both protein and DNA, but the third one couldn't. So if I clicked DNA and clicked secondary structure prediction, then that would be not a relevant type of analysis. So if I click now on the DNA button, you should be able to see that this checkbox next to secondary structure prediction is now grey, and when I try and hover over it, it has a sort of no entry sign, so I can't click it anymore. I can click the other two though as normal. I go back to protein, and now this button becomes clickable again. So here's the code that achieves that. I've written a function called deactivate element and a function called activate element, very much like the functions that I had before for hiding and showing elements. Of course, I could do the same. I could actually hide those elements rather than just deactivating them. So here it looks much the same. It's document.get element by ID and the identifier for the element, and then setting .disabled to true or .disabled to false. So when we look at the HTML, we'll just go down to the relevant part. We have then an identifier associated with the secondary structure one, ID equals SS, and when we look here at the sequence type, when you click on protein here, this one, then that element SS is activated. When I click on DNA, it's deactivated. Again, you can download and play with the code. The third application for JavaScript then we're going to look at is validating forms. So obviously your CGI script can do this, but it's also very useful to do it on the client side, in other words on the web browser, before you ever bother submitting something to the CGI script on the web server. So for example, we might want to check that an email address appears to be a proper email address. It's something followed by an @ sign followed by something dot something. Or if we were doing something in sequence analysis, we might want to check that a sequence was long enough to analyze it. Or perhaps if we're checking that, or if we're taking DNA as input, we might want to check that the only characters were A, T, C, and G. So let's have a look at the first example of checking an email address. We want to check that the string contains an @ sign, but that this isn't the first character. We want to check that the last dot occurs at least one character after the @ sign. And we want to check that the last dot isn't the last character. So in other words, we're looking for something at something dot something. So let's try doing an email address, and let's just put some random junk in first that is clearly not an email address, and click submit, and it comes up saying that the email address is invalid. Let's try adding the @ sign. Again, it's invalid. So let's put some text afterwards. Submit. Again, invalid. Add a dot. invalid. Just ignore the message there and put something else, and now it's valid. In this case, all I've done when a valid input goes in is to refresh the page. So let's have a look at the code that achieves this. So let's scroll down and look at the HTML first. It's a form. The action equals hash is why the page just refreshed. And it uses onSubmit this time to call this function called checkEmail. And what onSubmit does is calls the function. If the function returns false, then it won't submit the page. If the function returns true, then it will submit the page. We then have an email address, and we have an input submit button. So notice that where we had the input for the email address, we've given it an ID of email, and that gets passed to our check email function that gets run when you try and submit the form. So let's have a look at what that function does. Again, we see the document.getElementById and the identifier. We extract the value from that. So that's the text that somebody's entered. Again, I've got a bit of debugging code in here just to display it so I can check that it's working properly, but I've commented it out, this time using 2 slashes. Then we're looking to find where the @ sign occurs within the text. So we use the indexOf method in order to find that position. And we use lastIndexOf to find where the last dot occurred. Now, if the @ sign is less, the @ position, is less than 1, then it would be the very first character, and that wouldn't be a valid email address. So we're checking that we do have an @ sign in the string. We're then checking that the dot position is occurring at least 2 characters after the @ sign, and that it isn't the last character. If any of those things failed, which is why we've got a greater than sign here, we've got a less than sign here, which is kind of the opposite of the logic that you might expect. If any of those situations were encountered, then we put up the alert and we then return false when the user has clicked on the OK button. Otherwise, if none of those things occurred, in other words, the @ position was position 1 or greater, the dot was at least 2 characters after the @ and the dot wasn't the last character, then we return true and the form gets submitted. The next example then is checking that a sequence is long enough for some analysis that you want to do. So what we need to do is take the text that has been entered into the sequence box. We need to remove any spaces from that text or any line breaks, and then see how many characters are left. So let's just enter a short piece of text and click submit, and it says your sequence must contain at least 20 residues. So let's now make sure that we've actually got at least 20 residues and click submit, and you can see that as before the page has refreshed. Let's try again, this time putting some spaces in just to check that that works properly. Yes. Now let's just put a few characters and lots of spaces, so that's 20 characters in there, but most of them are spaces. And that it's complained about, as you'd expect. So again, let's have a quick look at the code. We have a function called checkSequence. Let's look at the HTML first. Again, it's a form with an onSubmit return checkSequence. This is the identifier where the text has been entered, and we're saying that there must be at least 20 characters. So we've got a text area, identifier of seek, seq, that's what gets passed into here. So let's look at the actual JavaScript function. It takes the identifier and the minimum length. Again, we see this sequence equals document.getElement by ID, the identifier, which was seek, that's what we had down here, and it returns the value of that. And again, I've got a bit of debugging code to be able to display that. Now I'm using the replace method for a text object to replace all the white space \s globally with nothing. And then again, I've got a bit of debugging code there. And then it says if the sequence length is less than the minimum length that we passed into the function, then we define this message: your sequence must contain at least however many residues. And then an alert displaying the message. When the user clicks OK, then we'll get return false. Otherwise, if it was all OK, we return true and the form gets submitted properly. Finally, we're going to look at AJAX, asynchronous JavaScript and XML. Now, what AJAX allows you to do is change the content of a page without refreshing it. So, normally, as we've seen with CGI scripts, what happens is that you have a form or a button or whatever. You enter your parameters, you click the form submit button, and that page disappears, and instead we get back the content of the page that was generated by the CGI script. So, in other words, the normal interaction with a web server involves replacing the current page with a new page. And this happens in a synchronous manner. In other words, everything stops and waits until the new page appears. Now, if that's something like running a blast search or a multiple sequence alignment or anything else that is time consuming, then you're going to be sitting waiting for some time until your page appears. Now, what AJAX allows you to do is update part of a page in an asynchronous manner. And that means that the user can continue to interact with the rest of the page while waiting for the refresh. It also means that we can display what we refer to as a throbber while waiting for the content to load. So a throbber is a simple little animated GIF image, typically a spinning wheel or something like that, which indicates that something is going on in the background. So this little cartoon illustrates what happens when we use AJAX. First of all, we have some sort of button, and when we click that, which we determine using an onClick attribute, it calls some JavaScript. Now, what the JavaScript has to do is create a request. And that request is tied, first of all, to opening a URL where the CGI script lives. We also have an onChange attribute, which specifies what happens when the CGI script returns. And generally what happens will be that we display that new bit of information. And finally we have a send method, which actually packages all this stuff together and sends it off. And what happens when you call that is that onChange sleeps until the change is seen, at which time this bit of code for displaying the results is called. So let's look at an example. First of all, let's do it the normal way. So here we have a slow CGI script. It's very simple. All it does is basically sleeps for 5 seconds and then displays a bit of text. But if I click this, you'll see what happens. So I click, and I now have to wait, and eventually I get a piece of text back. Now, if we use AJAX to do that instead, we'll click this button, Get Data, and what you'll see happen is that a throbber appears. We wait until the script comes back. We'll then get our data displayed in a div, which I have illustrated as a grey box here, and the throbber will disappear. So I'll click the button. Here's our throbber spinning, and the text appears in the box. So you can see we didn't switch to a new page, we displayed the content within the current page. We could have switched to a new page had we wished, but this allows us not to do so. So let's have a look at the code that does this, and it's not the simplest piece of code, so don't worry too much about it, but it's just here for kind of completeness. So here's the HTML. We have a paragraph containing a button, which we saw here. And that button has an identifier of get data. And when we click it, we pass two things into a function, display and throbber. Now, let's have a look at the rest of the HTML. First thing is we have a span with an identifier of throbber, and as we saw previously, we've set the display style to none. That means it will be hidden. And what occurs within that span is an image, and this is an animated GIF. We specify the height, and we have the text wait coming up if for some reason the image can't be displayed. We then have a div with an ID of display, and that has a grey background and a margin around it. That's this grey background here. So what happens when we click the button is that we call this function called getData, and we pass it three things. The first is the identifier for where we're going to display our results. Second is the identifier for where the throbber is, and the third is the CGI script that we want to call. Let's have a look at the CGI script then. That's very, very simple. It's just importing the sleep function. It's sleeping for 5 seconds, and then it's printing some HTML back. And note that we don't have the HTML header, we don't have the body, any of that. We just have content type set to HTML, and then a paragraph of welcome to AJAX. Now let's have a look at the JavaScript that we are going to call this, this getData function. So getData takes three parameters: the identifier for where the data is going to be displayed, the identifier for the throbber, and the URL of the CGI script. Now, the first thing we do is we have these three global variables: gData, gThrobberID, and gRequest. Now, you'll recall that I said that if we put var in front of a variable name, it will be local to the particular function. If we don't, then it becomes global. So I'm using the same standard that I adopted before of naming global variables with a lowercase g and then an uppercase letter. So the first global variable, and we have to use global variables to do this, is that identifier of where the data is going to be displayed. The second is the identifier of the throbber. And the third is this mysterious gRequest thing, which is the result of calling a function called createRequest, and we'll have a look at that in just a second. There's then a bit of error checking. If that gRequest was null, in other words creating the request failed, then we come up with an alert saying error creating request object, and we return. The next thing we do is we activate the throbber. So you've seen that sort of thing before. We then open the request, passing it the URL, and the true here says that this is an asynchronous call. We then set this on ready state change. So if we go back up to our diagram, this is the on change bit in the diagram. We specify what we're going to do when the results come back, essentially. And what we're going to do is call a function called update data, and then we send it. So that actually sends the request and waits for the results to come back. So let's have a look at this create request thing that we've done up here, this mysterious bit. Now this you don't need to worry about at all. It's complete boilerplate. You just copy and paste it into anything that you do that's using AJAX. So basically what it does is it uses a try and catch mechanism, first of all, to try creating a request object using this XML HTTP request. If that fails, then we try using ActiveX object with MSXML2, and if that fails, then we try ActiveX object with Microsoft.xml HTTP. Now, the reason that we have this is that Microsoft browsers have two different ways of doing it. Non-Microsoft browsers have this way of doing it. So we try each of these in turn. And if the last one failed, then we set the request type to null, the request object to null, and say basically we couldn't create anything. So that's what's going on here. As I say, you don't need to worry about that at all. It is just boilerplate. You just have to do this. These are built in. So we're just saying we're using the get method rather than the post method for talking to the server. This is the URL we're communicating with, and we want it to be asynchronous. This is the next bit that we've had to write code for, update data. So this is what we call when the request has completed. So let's have a look at that. What that does here is tests. So notice it's using the global G request here. It tests that the ready state is set to 4 or to complete. Again, you don't need to worry about the details of that. It's just a standard thing you have to do. Test for one or the other because it depends what the browser is. And when that happens, we set this variable data to be the response text from gRequest. Now, response text will contain whatever the CGI script returned. And then we call another function called display data. We give it that global data ID, which was the identifier for where we want to display the results. We pass it the results, and then we deactivate the throbber. Now this is why you need those three things to be global: gRequest, gDataID, and gThrobberID, because there's no way of passing anything into this function. If we go back to where it was called, we just say onReadyStateChange equals update data. That's the name of the function. There is no way of passing things into that function. So here was my activate throbber function, which is just as you've seen before. It's get element by ID, the identifier for the throbber, style, display, set to inline, and then the last thing we did here when we did the update data after displaying was to hide the throbber again. So there's the hide throbber, deactivate throbber code. Is just the same as we've seen before. Get element by ID, the identifier for the throbber, set the style.display to none. And the one remaining bit of code is that which displays the data itself. It's taking an identifier and the data to be displayed. Remember, that came from our CGI script. Let's just look back at that. It was just a paragraph containing the text, "Welcome to AJAX." If we go back down again, display data, what it's doing then is document.getElementById data ID. This was the ID for the div where we want to display the results. And then we have this magic bit .innerHTML, which sets the HTML within that div to be whatever came back from our CGI script. So we had that div tag. Let's just look back at the HTML itself. This div tag, which is here, and then you can see the div is currently empty, but we'll put that paragraph, which came from the CGI script, with "Welcome to AJAX," within that div. And so you will then get the text displayed as it appears here. So it's a little bit complicated, but once you get into using it, it's not too bad. There are also frameworks available within kind of libraries and packages which make it simpler to do this, and you can ignore quite a lot of it. But it's once you've got your head around the idea of something being asynchronous, it's not really too bad. You just use this as a recipe, and you can use it for all sorts of applications. Finally, we'll look at some references and further reading. Various things related to best practice with JavaScript. We've talked about, for the project, automated documentation of code. So there's a system called JSDoc, which can be used to do that with JavaScript. Here are three links which I'm not going to visit, but they give you ways of doing best practice in terms of JavaScript. So one from w3.org, one from W3 Schools, one just called JavaScript the Right Way. Here are a couple of tutorials, one from W3 Schools, one from Tutorials Point. So you can learn more about JavaScript from those. And then, as I mentioned, there are various frameworks and things that make life easier. One is Bootstrap, which is used for these web pages. Bootstrap lets you do all sorts of nice things like the accordions and things that you've seen on these tutorial pages. It looks after menus and drop-down menus and all that sort of thing. It also has a very nice library of CSS to make your pages look attractive as well. jQuery is a library which again provides you with a number of things like drop-downs and accordions and that sort of thing, and also provides you with an easier way of doing the get element type things. It has a clever little function that allows you just to specify elements with a hash instead. So that's used very widely. These are more advanced frameworks for building JavaScript and doing AJAX and things. I've never used any of these, but they're all quite popular. And there's a link here to a Wikipedia comparison of different JavaScript frameworks. A couple of examples of JavaScript. So this one, JSAV, is actually my code. It's a JavaScript sequence alignment viewer, which we use as part of our ABASYS system, our antibody analysis software. Let's have a quick look at the demonstration. So what this does, is it's displaying a set of sequences using JavaScript. It allows you then to select a region of a sequence by doing this. You can see the region highlighted here, and then you can sort the sequences based on the region you've selected. You can choose a couple of sequences and delete them from the display. You can export sequences in FastA. You can change the coloring scheme. You can change to a dotted representation. So if the amino acid is the same as the one above, it just shows a dot. And we can also get it so that it doesn't colour the ones which are the same as the one above. So this is actually a slightly earlier version of the code. We now have lots more facilities built into it as well. All written in JavaScript. Everything that you're seeing happens on the fly within your web browser. So if we go back here and resort, then this is all happening within the web browser. That's freely available. You can download it, make use of it. Just as we have BioPython, there's also BioJS. BioJS gives you a whole slew of different JavaScript plugins that you can use within a web page for bioinformatics purposes, including things like a structure viewer here. And then there are a number of things for doing graphics. So d3.js is a very, very powerful library for manipulating documents based on data. It allows you to do all sorts of very powerful things and construct your own graphs and so on. I've actually been using that recently for a kind of event clock, because I wanted to look at things like how when my web server is most frequently accessed. So it basically provides a 24-hour clock and then overlays that with kind of lines whenever there's an access to a particular page. And then there are a number of charts and graph plotting applications. You can do charts and graphs using D3, but there are lots of things that make it very, very easy for you to put line charts, pie charts, and so on into your web pages. So there's Google Charts, which actually talks to Google servers. Chart.js works within your web browser. Highcharts.js also works within your web browser and is free for non-commercial use, but you have to pay a license fee to use it in anything commercial. Again, there are some comparisons on Wikipedia and SitePoint on different graph plotting libraries. And just to finish off then, here are a few general textbooks on JavaScript. I particularly recommend in general the O'Reilly textbooks, this one and this one. Headrush AJAX is quite a good introduction, but I find the style a bit annoying. It's just pictures of confused people and things throughout the book, but personally I prefer the sort of standard textbooks like this one, the definitive guide.